Often I will ask students how they planned their essays, and either I will hear that they didn't plan or that they just listed some topics for each paragraph and then started writing. But if you're going to construct a convincing argument, the information in each paragraph needs to be logically sequenced. So here's a strategy for you to use to logically sequence the information in each paragraph. It's called self-question your point sentence. Self-questioning is an incredibly powerful habit. If you're constantly thinking from the perspective of the reader and questioning yourself from that perspective, you'll end up as a good writer. So let's just review the structure of an argument before we go into the body paragraph so that we can put it into context. An argument starts with a thesis, what we're going to prove. It moves on to the arguments, 1, 2, or 3 arguments that we're going to use to prove that thesis, and then we reinforce that thesis. Each of those arguments will be broken down into the point or claim that we want to prove, the evidence we're going to use to prove that, where necessary, an explanation of how that evidence proves that point, and a summary before we move on. So let's take an example from a grade 10 student's essay. This is a body paragraph on an essay about social justice, and the student's point sentence is, a lack of recognition that native South Africans were of equal value to whites led to acceptance of the denial of their basic human rights. This was in the context of apartheid. So note that this is quite a complex point sentence, a really nice one actually, and states a causal relationship between two abstract ideas. Those two abstract ideas are firstly this idea of a lack of recognition, secondly the idea of acceptance of this denial of human rights, and thirdly, then those two abstract ideas are connected with this causal verb led to. So the self-questioning we're going to do about this point sentence is using this question, what smaller claims are embedded in my point? So let's ask ourselves that question. And the reason we're going to ask that question is because from a reader's perspective, if the logic is going to be sequenced well and really tight, we need to prove each of those smaller claims in order to get them to accept and believe our overall argument. So let's go one at a time. First, what smaller claims are embedded in my point? The first claim is this idea that there's a lack of recognition that native South Africans are of equal value. So what we need to do is to turn that into a claim that we can prove in evidence by making it a complete sentence. And it might be something like, native South Africans were not recognized as being of equal value to whites. Okay, the second smaller claim, if we ask ourselves once again, that's embedded in this point is this idea of acceptance. And once again, we need to turn that into a full sentence that we can make as a claim that can be proved with evidence. It might be something like, white South Africans accepted the denial of basic human rights to the native community. Lastly, so we've proved the idea there was a lack of recognition. We've proved the idea that whites accepted this denial of human rights. We haven't yet proved that one caused the other. So once again, we need to turn this into a full sentence claim that we can prove with some evidence, and it might be something like, the lack of recognition was the cause of this acceptance. So now that we've got 3 subpoints, we need to sequence them logically. The most logical sequence is often going to be, not always, but often going to be the sequence that was in our point sentence. And it's also logical that we need to prove the 2 abstract ideas, the idea of recognition and acceptance, before we can prove that there was a causal connection between them. So once we've got our 3 subpoints, each of them will need its own evidence. Where necessary, it will also need an explanation of how the evidence proves that subpoint. And then our paragraph will need a summary sentence to round it off before we move on to the next argument. So if we go back to our model, we've added the idea that sometimes each paragraph will need some subpoints and evidence to really tease out the logic and lead our reader by the hand to believing our argument. Okay, if you want to go one step further, there's another strategy called flowchart your point sentence that you can also use to make the logic even one step tighter.